Good morning, everyone. Good to see you. We're using the microphone in part because the event's being live streamed, so forgive us as we're passing microphones back and forth, even if you could likely hear us without them. Thank you, Margarita, for hosting the event, and to all your co-sponsors. My name is RJ Snell. I'm Director of Academic Programs at the Witherspoon Institute here in town and the moderator for this panel. The title of this panel is Culture and the Common Good, Theological and Philosophical Perspectives on Beauty and Our Life Together. So we're going to be trying to think about how beauty relates to the common good, how beauty can in fact relate to community life and the well-being of communities. It seems obvious to many that the common good or the commonality of communities is perhaps under some stress or some fragmentation. It's not obvious we know what the common good is. It's not obvious that the common good is always being experienced or indeed flourishing at all. Now, it seems somewhat interesting, or maybe even in some tension, to think of how beauty relates to the common good. It seems to me that there is some tension there. Beauty, as we know, we have a cliche on this, is in the eye of the beholder. Beauty, as we know, can be a very private and subjective experience. What I find to be beautiful leaves you cold. What I find gives me a strangely warm heart, you find somewhat repulsive. And so beauty seems to be something potentially individualistic, subjective, and private. On the other hand, we have also all had the experience, perhaps at the recessional hymn, or at the fireworks on July 4th, or at the singing of the national anthem, where we feel a deep commonality and bond with each other through an experience of beauty or what have you. But of course, the questions continue. Did that sense of commonality have much to do with beauty, or did it have to do with a sense of fellow feeling, of belonging? As a younger man, I remember feeling a great sense of belonging at a concert of a band that I would now be embarrassed to admit that I appreciated and admired, and would not let my children listen to or admire. And I've also felt it at listening to Beethoven. So perhaps it didn't have much to do with beauty at all. Perhaps it simply had to do with group dynamics and belonging to something. But we also have to ask, how does beauty relate to the good, let alone to the common good? You can have group dynamics and a sense of fellow feeling through a song at a cult, or in mass hysteria, or a group of real evil. So we're trying to figure out how beauty relates to the common good, not only asking the question of beauty and some of the tensions and questions that beauty naturally elicits to us, but also paying attention to different theological and philosophical traditions which will be represented here on the stage. Joining us today, and we'll proceed in this order, first with about short 5-minute presentations, and then just a conversation back and forth among us. First is David Corey from Baylor University and Baylor in Washington, D.C., Father Reginald Lynch from the Dominican House of Studies, and Gordon Mikoski here from Princeton Theological Seminary. So thank you so much for joining us, and with that, we'll begin with David.
Does this work? There we go. Well, maybe as an opening, I'll just say a few things about the difficulty of defining beauty to make our matters worse. There is a Platonic dialogue on beauty. It's a very short one. It's the Greater Hippias, so it's bigger than the Shorter Hippias, but it's still a short dialogue, and it ends in an impasse. They don't actually succeed at defining beauty, and I think that's a pretty good starting point for us. It's difficult to get a general statement that encompasses everything that's beautiful and excludes everything that's not beautiful, the typical Socratic problem of defining. But I want to just, without trying to define philosophically, lay down a few characteristics of beauty that might help the conversation. One is that I suspect it's ineffable. That is to say, we can't adequately capture it in words, though we know it when we see it or hear it. The second is that I often wonder whether beauty is the right object of analysis, because I think that beauty is an instance of a broader category, and that category is aesthetic experience. And if we broaden out to aesthetic experience, we can solve some puzzles about beauty. For example, if we listen to classical music, we might say it's beautiful, but if we listen to Verdi's Requiem and the Dies Irae, the day of wrath of the Verdi's Requiem, the word beauty doesn't leap to mind. And yet we are engaged in something we typically and conventionally call the beautiful, even though we're listening to a piece that's deliberately frightful and in some ways ugly. We need to broaden out to the concept of aesthetic experience to be able to let in experiences that in common sense get grouped with beauty, but in fact are not always beautiful in the simple sense of the word. That would be my second point. And when we broaden that out to culture, I think that matters, because I think there are questions about politics and aesthetic experience that are a little bit broader than questions about politics and beauty. The third and final point is that the experience of beauty, as well as aesthetic experience in general, is potentially an intrinsic good, which makes it quite different from most of the goods we surround ourselves with and participate in. Like other intrinsic goods, it could be put to use, that is to say, it could be pursued not intrinsically, but as an instrumental good for purposes it can bring about. And we do that, for example, in the revolution, when we bend art and music to the purposes of the revolution. But that's in a way to pervert something. Beauty doesn't need to be put to any use to be meaningful. And that's why it's a unique way of answering Margarita's desideratum for meaning. Turns out, as far as I can tell, that human meaning comes about most prominently, most visibly, most obviously in communal practices around intrinsic goods. And there aren't very many of them. There's love, friendship, play, worship, aesthetic experience, and pure intellectual inquiry, not for something, but for its own sake, for understanding, as Aristotle would say. And it's in a liberal capitalist culture that tends to instrumentalize everything, even friendships, even religion, that these primary goods that deliver meaning to human life get lost. And so I think, for me at least, that's going to be the key to any questions about what the relevance of beauty is in our politics.
Well, great. Well, thank you. It's a privilege to be here, and I'm grateful to be part of this panel. I think, speaking from a Thomistic perspective, is this better? Okay. Speaking from a Thomistic perspective, there are a number of intramural debates, let's say, within Thomism about the nature of beauty for Aquinas and its relationship to the human person and human society. But one thing that all working from a Thomistic perspective agree with is that there's an intrinsic relationship between what's classically called the transcendentals and the experience of beauty. Whether or not you count beauty among the transcendentals themselves with the Platonists, or whether you follow a slightly different modified tradition where beauty is a kind of aspect, let's see, a tangible aspect of goodness. There's an intrinsic connection between transcendental concepts like goodness, like truth, oneness, which ultimately lead back to the commonality of the divine essence for Aquinas, which connects the idea of beauty with other types of concepts like divine exemplarity and the moral life, precisely because goodness itself as a concept forms the perfectibility of the individual creature, the human person, as a sort of journey back to God, a journey back to the exemplarity of the Creator. And so beauty in this sense, even as an aesthetic experience, is something that can deeply inform a Thomistic understanding of the moral life when we think about what it means to be a human person, what it means to be happy, what it means to grow in communion with God and with one's neighbor. Beauty as whether it's the aesthetic experience of visual art or even just the encounter with something, an idea, let's say, which is beautiful, or some other experience of that kind. It's an encounter, effectively, according to the mind of Aquinas, with the goodness of God, transcendentally mediated, if you will, through the smaller individuated instances of goodness that occur in creation and that are more accessible to our experience. One way to think about this is in terms of the primacy of form for Aquinas and the Thomistic tradition rather than the material. And that is to say that what's most true and what's most universal, what's most true for all of us, what's most true for every historical period of human history, is what is most true of God himself. And so form, in that sense, is the truth behind the experience. As human persons, we have a certain amount of contact with that through our senses and through our everyday experience. But God, as it were, has a kind of top-down view of formality, a view of substances and essences from the inside out that we will never have according to our natural process of knowing. But the construction of art objects, for example, if you ask certain Thomistic philosophers like Umberto Eco or others in that vein, Jacques Maritain, the construction of art objects, whether it be a symphony or a painting or anything of that kind, makes the accidental features of beauty correctly and proportionally arranged a more accessible experience of the deeper formalities that inform our existence, that inform reality. And so art, in that sense, as a construct of human experience, has a definitive role to play in forming our appreciation of the good and forming our moral lives together as individuals and as a society.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you.
This past Tuesday was a big event that mainly went unnoticed. That is, on Tuesday of this week was the 200th anniversary of the birth of someone who has deeply impacted at least every American in this room, probably without most of us knowing it, and that was the 200th birthday of Frederick Law Olmsted, the designer of Central Park, the one who is responsible for cities in America having public parks. He's also responsible for Yosemite being preserved, Niagara Falls, the inspiration and the principles that guided the establishment of the national park system. Frederick Law Olmsted grew up in Hartford, Connecticut as a Calvinist in the Congregationalist vein of things, so I'm representing kind of the Reformed tradition. And even though I'm Presbyterian, the Congregationalists are close cousins of ours. And Frederick Law Olmsted lived next door to one of the most famous of the liberal Reformed pastors and theologians, but a little too liberal for his family, Horace Bushnell. Eventually, he moved away from organized Christianity because he saw that clergy in particular were hypocrites, basically, who didn't practice what they preached. They talked a lot, but they didn't actually embody charity or kindness or love to their fellow human being. Before he became a landscape architect, probably the first landscape architect, he worked for the New York Times when it was just being established. And his assignment was to walk through the South of this country and to write dispatches back about what was going on in the 1850s. He said, I'm going to have an open mind, and I will just write what I see. By the time he was done writing about his journeys through the South, he became an ardent abolitionist because of what he saw, of the inhumanity of humans to other humans, blacks and whites, in that institution. And his work in public parks, especially New York's Central Park, was connected with his abolitionism. That is, human beings need beauty of all races, classes, genders, to be together and to experience beauty in order for democracy to work. Because cities tend to have dehumanizing aspects to them, especially in the industrial aspects of the 19th century, but even today. So Central Park is, I would say, and it's not my idea, somebody else said this, but I think it's true, the most important work of art in the 19th century, maybe of all in American history. It's because nothing you see in Central Park is what it was when Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux found it. It's all constructed with the idea of having experiences of beauty for all peoples. Unlike in Europe, where the wealthy could have access to beauty. But in America, the idea was all peoples should mix together freely, apart from the dehumanizing aspects of capitalism and the city, in order to recover their God-given sense of what it is to be human. So a park is a work of art, and it's a poetic embodiment of God-given beauty. So the more I think about this, the more I think that parks, public parks in our cities, are embodied icons. They do almost everything that Orthodox icons do theologically, but they're embodied and they're democratic for the common good.
So one of the things I would like to explore is the role of beauty in the common good. It's been brought up by each of you in a slightly different way. Gordon mentions the gathering place of the park. David mentioned the role of aesthetic experience in community events, a festivity. Although Reginald mentioned the morally formative power that beauty can bring. We have, it seems to me, been trying for a long time in our political theory, when we think about how to create the common good, been privileging reason. Should we continue to do that? And how is reason part of the problem? What role is there in using beauty to challenge, to perfect, to augment reason? Why shouldn't we continue with the way we're going in political theory of trying to find enlightenment, ideas, the argument, the analysis?
That's a great question, RJ. Yeah, I think we'd have to define reason first. I think it's underappreciated that Thomism, if you will, as a perspective or a worldview, is first and foremost a theological one that's based in a contemplative life of prayer that centers one's whole reality and one's whole existence, as it were, around the idea of God and His revelation. But secondly, it's also a pre-modern worldview, right? So it's just as opposed to the rationalism of the 17th and 18th century as it is to maybe other forms of subjectivity and that sort of thing. So I do think that the opposition, let's say, between aesthetics and rationalism that's perhaps crept into our discourse is a problem in some ways. And recovering a living connection between beauty and contemplation might be a way out of that. That would be my response.
I think that's a good question. What do we mean by rationality? Rationality is God-given, but it's not free from corruption. That is, reason can be used to rationalize all kinds of things, including consumer capitalism, and to managerialize, using reason to make everything work efficiently and so on, and to put us in a kind of cage that dehumanizes us. So going back to the park thing, Frederick Olmsted never had a walkway that was a straight, rational line. It was always meandering, so that it would be a kind of holistic engagement with the mind, for sure, but also the emotion and the body and the social. So the mind disconnected from emotion and embodiment and social reality can lead us into some very dehumanizing places. But reason is not bad, but it can be used to justify, rationalize things that may be dehumanizing. But the best way probably to keep it properly balanced is to also connect it with what it means to be a human in a holistic sense.
Yeah, so there are two kinds of reason, and the one that we're worried about here is the instrumental form of reason rather than the contemplative form of reason that is able to apprehend the forms of things in our daily experience. There's a real temptation when thinking about beauty in politics, and I can go with it some way, but there's a paradox here that we have to attend to. The idea is, well, we want a healthy polity, we want a reasonable polity, but people are more than instrumental reason. Therefore, let's window dress with some beauty. The paradox is that when you treat beauty like that, you've subverted the thing that makes it special. So, and yet, it's true, we want the trappings of beauty around our public life. So it's not that you can just say, don't do that. We should do that. But there also needs to be room in our public life for the participation in beauty as a thing in itself, as a good that nourishes us and that takes us out of the instrumental, or let's say utilitarian mindset, which, if that dominates the instrumental or utilitarian mindset, everything is for something else, then we become chains of meaning strung in midair with no ground. Everything is for something else, and that's what meaninglessness is, that we don't actually touch down on the things that find their meaning per se in the activities themselves and in those unique goods.
The longer that I stay in the academy, the more I get worried about staying in the academy. And a test that I've devised for myself is, what would my grandfather say in response to this claim? So Grandpa was a good man. Grandpa was also a very practical man. He was a farmer and a rancher. So I'm trying to imagine saying to my grandfather, so I'm playing skeptic here. I'm trying to imagine saying to my grandfather, what we need for a healthy polity is more contemplation. I could imagine my grandfather rolling his eyes about this. So let's explore. So we need a sort of receptivity, or beauty does encourage a kind of receptivity, it seems to me. It's a productive receptivity. It's not merely passive, but it does call us to attend. In what fashion does beauty allow us to attend in a commonality, as opposed to my own attendance and my own private experience? And then what are the moral guardrails for that? So it seems to me one of the reasons that we have this promise of reason in politics is that it is democratic. We're rational animals, everyone can reason. And a worry that experiences of beauty can be madness and uncontrolled. So first, how do we get commonality out of contemplation? And then what are the guardrails so that beauty doesn't lead to a sort of madness, but in fact a reasonable, rational polity?
That's a great question, RJ. Yeah, I think, so one way to think about reason in this sense, particularly in light of the emotions and other things, is just really to think of the rational faculty, the understanding and the will as working in consort with the emotions and the passions, not to think of them as opposed, certainly not to think of oneself as a sort of brain in a vat or something like that, trying to figure out political life or anything else from within one's own sort of orbit alone. But one of the ways in which the passions or emotional experience can really inform a life of contemplation is simply through their immediacy to experience. There's a degree of immediacy and even a reactiveness to experience there that really comes before, let's say, a more dedicated contemplative act. Contemplation would be sort of the highest chain, if you will, of the process. One can circle up and circle back down to experience and allow experience of beauty and other experiences that maybe aren't so beautiful also, right? That come into our sensory purview, our emotional purview, to be the sort of seeds of contemplation, to allow us to reflect more deeply on meaning and questions of that kind, and ultimately on questions related to God and the human person, but then to allow that to come back down and even inform. Although, Aquinas will say we always, at least in this life, we have a sort of political relationship with our passions, and he's following Aristotle there. So there's never a sense of rationalistic sort of dominance. And I think that's a good thing, actually. It's part of human life and part of being alive as a human person in the world. But nonetheless, a contemplative focus which sees, even if just implicitly and intuitively, the implications of who God is and who the human person is in light of experience, and allows that to inform decision-making and judgments about what's good, judgments about what's true, and even what's beautiful is a good thing, I think, and a healthy thing, yeah.
Maybe just two quick observations that could get Grandpa confused. The first one I thought myself, but I was greatly affirmed in seeing it in Thomistic literature. The contemplation of God is a highly exalted act, but contemplation itself happens all the time, and it happens on mundane objects, it happens to children, it happens to grown-ups. You can't not do it. So it's actually an experience that we all have access to. It's an arresting of the utilitarian relationship to things in order to perceive them in their essence with a sense of awe. Second point, we can say, you like chocolate ice cream, I like vanilla, what I find beautiful, you find appalling, but that's actually exaggerated. It's not the case that there is a mathematical clarity to beauty and that we all can say it's true like a formula is true. It's also not the case that it's just random. There are communal common sense standards of beauty. There are things we find beautiful even though there are outliers. There are reasons for the things we find beautiful. In other words, by and large, beauty taps into a cosmos that has order and reason behind it and that produces common assessments of things. It's not as bad as complete subjectivity. If it were, we couldn't have conversations about beauty, but we do. And we do find similar things beautiful most of the time.
I used to be irritated reading Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics as a practical theologian. I love that book. And then at the end, he says, there's something higher than practical reason, and that's contemplative reason. And it took me a long time to figure out why is he saying that. And I think it's because that's what makes us human. We have the free play of curiosity and interest to just muse at the way things are without trying to fix something or do something. And it actually makes sense to me now that, you know, some of the most ugly pieces of art are things done for an ethical cause. I don't find a lot of Marxist art that beautiful, personally, but having free play of imagination. I also read Aristotle through Kant. You know, what makes us human in Kant's vision is spontaneity. There's a spark of freedom at the heart of us. And both, I think, taken together, point in the direction of Sabbath keeping. That even the most creative being of all, if you can say God is a being, doesn't work all the time. God takes a break and enjoys and appreciates. There has to be a space for freedom and spontaneity and play even. And counterintuitively, I don't think that what will solve our political problems is more hard work and hard thinking, maybe. Maybe it's to recover a sense of taking a break and having free play of imagination and space to encounter people with whom we differ without an agenda.
I would imagine that for many of us, this seems intuitive. We're in agreement. So can we do a bit of diagnosis of why what seems so obvious and seems so obvious for so long to so many in so many traditions seems so absent or foreign to our contemporary moment? So let's try and do a little diagnosis. So you mentioned Olmsted's Park. There's a great Olmsted Park in Milwaukee where I lived right on the edge of the park and spent many happy hours there. The county commissioner at the time when I lived in Milwaukee was going to close down, he later became governor, he was going to close down part of the park. He was going to develop some of the park. And I was morally horrified. It's the only letter to the editor I ever wrote was writing about this. Please don't do this to Olmsted's Park. Or David, in your initial comments, I was reminiscent of what sort of intrinsic goods and commonalities. I was thinking of Joseph Pieper's book, one of my favorites, In Tune with the World, where Pieper says the difficulty is not throwing a festival. The difficulty is finding people capable of enjoying one. He says we're so existentially poor that the idea of doing things for their own sake, contemplating either in the highest things, let's say, from Book 10 of the Ethics, or the mundane things of every day, we struggle to do so. Why is this so foreign to our common moment, or to our current moment, what we're articulating here and the insights behind?
If you unpack what we mean when we say we're a pluralist country, one way of understanding that is that we have different ends that we're pursuing. You can see this on the progressive versus the conservative spectrum. There are certain goods, certain ends, social justice, progressives are pursuing. There are certain ends, certain goods, family life, traditional morality. These are just examples that conservatives are pursuing, but we are likewise pursuing ends. In a country where those ends are the subject of extreme disagreement, and in a country where the power of the government and the purse are very high, the stakes get very high. And we slip into an attitude of politics as if it's a species of war. It's something, not cooperation, but war. And Hobbes is the best analyst or diagnostician of that condition, because in the condition of war, there will be no, and he proceeds to list things that are valuable in their own right. Everything gets instrumentalized. And I think we're less capable of participating in intrinsic goods because our relationship to goods is one of political utility, sometimes economic utility in a different vein. And our relationship to ourselves has become one not of disinterested friendship, but of what I like to call comradeship. We're comrades in a cause. And this affects the way we perceive things all the way down.
I think in terms of diagnosis of the problem, it's our minds have been colonized by consumer global capitalism. I'm not a Marxist, but there's a lot of truth in the diagnosis that Marx offers. We're just caught up in a frenzy of acquisition and trying to get money. Some of it's just to survive, but it was interesting. I mean, most of the pandemic lockdown was bad, right? We all suffered from that in various ways, some more than others. But I remember being in endless Zoom meetings, looking out my window, and I was like, oh, there's flowers out there. And oh, there's a fox on this street right here out inside of my house. And I just thought, wow, I never noticed those things before. Because I'm so busy as an academic, doing all my academic, very serious stuff. And I wouldn't say that the pandemic was a good thing, but it at least caused a lot of us to have opportunities to stop and to reevaluate. I think one of the reasons that there's a shortage of labor in restaurants and things is because some people decided, after having a chance to pull out of the frenzy of global consumer capitalism, to say, is this really worth it? Is this what I want to do with my life? And then saying, no, I'm going to do something else, and redirecting. Not everybody has that freedom or that option, but I do think unplugging from the machine is pretty significant, and it's the economic machine that is probably the biggest cause of the problem. I don't have a better alternative, because I certainly don't want to go in the direction of every attempt of Marxism that's been enacted, and I don't believe that if you just give Marx a chance, it'll all work out. So we have a problem, but I think capitalism in its consumerist global aspects is killing us.
Yeah, I think I would, just to echo what's already been said, and maybe to expand a bit, I think one thing that's really missing from discourse is the Socratic method in some ways, and a recovery of true philosophy in the classic sense that seeks the truth as a good for all, and also recognizes at the outset that no one entering into the process has all the answers. But by contrast, ideology believes in its own answers so stridently that it, resorts to violence to silence the other side. And I think, there's traces of that in all corners of our culture today. And I think that's a great poverty, intellectual poverty in many ways, that in previous generations and in previous times, the humanities championed in many ways that type of discourse. And I think that's maybe something we could recover.
So to follow up in a similar sort of theme, Pieper continues by saying that many of us no longer can, in fact, see. We're so existentially poor, maybe because of an agonism in politics, maybe because of consumerism, false understanding of teaching and philosophy, other reasons as well that we could explore. We've become not physiologically incapable of seeing, but existentially incapable of seeing. How to recover sight? So it seems that one of the things that we're suggesting is the power of beauty to create community, to allow us to see, to contemplate, to live, to flourish. If Pieper's at all right that we have lost the power to see, it's then difficult to imagine how beauty breaks through. It can be everywhere and not known. So how do we use beauty to foster virtue, help recover the soul, and so on, when the soul is not disposed to being recovered? Beauty will save the world, but somebody needs to be there to be saved.
Well, that's obviously a very difficult question. Since the name of Socrates has been evoked, it might not be that this fragile way of experiencing God's gifts before us can be taught on a grand scale. This might be something that we can set the conditions to encourage individuals to come to experience. Certainly, the liberal arts, as they were classically understood, open up windows to this experience. And then there's the problem that the classical arts, liberally understood, was not for the mass of our country, right? I mean, it was for a fairly elite minority, not because we're slaves, but because we're slaves to necessity or careerism or something like that. To have the images available and to encourage, this would be my cultural or political hope, that we can recover institutions where small groups of people, because that's where it really does work, can engage in the activity of co-enjoying beauty. This can happen in churches, it can happen in schools, it can happen in clubs, it can happen at museums. I'm leery of national solutions that are heavy-handed, that are trying to, in your phrase, use beauty, ... because of the paradoxical nature of beauty itself.
Well, when I think about this question, I think about Gen Z, which is at this point about 36% unaffiliated with any religious organization. It doesn't mean necessarily, I'm not sure I agree that interest in beauty has been driven out. There's a tremendous interest in mystery and in the transcendent, but in not the usual terms. I mean, I think it's just part of our nature that we're always interested in something that's beyond ourselves, or that we're touched by it, either music or narrative or film or something. And I see a whole generation of people who don't look to churches as the answer, but they are interested in something beyond themselves, something that is meaningful, and they don't really have the language to talk about. So it's a lot of dabbling and appropriating here and there, but there's a deep hunger. I think it's not gone away. It's just not in the ways that traditionally formed church people recognize.
Yeah, I think just to expand on some of that, it is difficult to communicate objective standards for beauty at times, particularly when we live maybe in a society now when there's so much seeming disagreement or lack of consensus about what is true or what is good. What is the place of aesthetics in that conversation, right? Certainly in post-modernity, there's been, aesthetics has taken the place of morality in a Nietzschean sense, or it's adopted other sort of larger philosophical roles in existentialism and phenomenology. But I think a recovery of a meaningful sense of aesthetics as in relation to the social whole or the common good, for at least from a Thomistic perspective, will always involve some reference to the transcendent and ultimately to God himself, who is the common good, according to Aquinas. And that doesn't mean that every painting and every aesthetic experience has to be an explicitly religious one. Certainly not. That lacks a certain human authenticity, in fact, that doesn't express wholly the breadth of human experience. But nonetheless, the presence of transcendence in art by reference, even in darker depictions of human suffering, there's transcendence, I would say, by reference, let's say, in Picasso's Blue Period, for example, or other types of art like that, that really evoke, let's say, a darker spectrum of human emotion, but nonetheless resonate with the truth and ultimately the good.
Well, so we're to the church, so let's talk about the church then. I don't know what everyone else's experience is like, but certainly my experience of beauty in church is the terms have very little to do with each other. That a great catastrophe has occurred, and that beauty is often used in sheerly manipulative ways in church, the sort of sense of now we will concoct worship and make you feel as if you are worshiping God. or we can think of the sort of dreadful kind. Years ago, my mother enrolled us in like a DVD of the month club for the children, and it's the most schlocky Christian films of all time, where you pray and you win the football game and get saved, and it's all very nice. You know the type. We've denuded the churches and so on. So at a time where there is, I still think, an existential poverty. I don't disagree that the human nature remains what it is, and people look for mystery oftentimes outside of the church. The churches, and we don't want a national solution, right? We don't want the National Board of Beauty to come in. Could you imagine? What is beauty's role in the church, and what ought that be like?
Okay. Well, yeah, it's certainly true that there's an awful lot of bad ecclesiastical art out there, or other things like that. I think, kitsch is always the enemy of true art, right? In the sense that, and it's a risk if art isn't properly understood or taken seriously, then kitsch is the default result, basically, and that can get pretty bad at times, right? And instead of being a gateway to a transcendent understanding of the person or morality in relation to the authentic perfection of the person, it ends up just being a moralism at best, which is not helpful. So I think there are real challenges there, but abstracting perhaps from the challenges of our present time, I think the balance of true aesthetics in a sacred context is a delicate one, and one that requires real work and attentiveness, and that takes time and effort, to say the least. So.
There was a phrase in what you said when you were contrasting kitsch to beauty, and then you said, beauty opens like a window into the transcendent, and that's why it's invited into church. Right. It does help. It is a delicate balance. This is a terrific book on the subject, by the way, that was being handed out. Beauty in the Light of the Redemption wrestles with this question, and it does so in a really light-handed but profound way. In church, beauty is I would risk saying it is a handmade, but it's a handmade because of what it essentially is, and that is that it's a door into something. It's a door into transcendence, and it puts one in awareness that there are things bigger than oneself, and that there are standards higher than one's own standards, and for that reason, it belongs in church. But the danger of kitsch, I would agree, is extremely real.
I'm probably from the wrong tradition to talk about beauty in church. How can you tell you're in a Calvinist space? Because it's beige. We don't do visual beauty in church traditionally in the Calvinist world or Reformed world, because it's about the beauty of Scripture, right? It's all of our spaces for worship are about hearing. It's about the ear, hearing the words of Scripture. We're good Muslims in that respect. We don't want images. We want patterns, but really it's about hearing holy text. And so in the Reformed tradition, you basically have to rebel against that, because I think that died. Oh, it's still there. You have to rebel against the fetishization of simplicity and a kind of anesthetic sense. Like Van Gogh, for example, who grew up in a Reformed pastor's house and had to rebel against parts of his faith in order to just reclaim a sense of beauty. Interestingly, Calvin wasn't against art and painting and sculpture and so on. It's just don't drag it into church so that you fixate on those things and not hear the word of the Lord. So we have a problem in the Reformed tradition with beauty in church if it's not the beauty of, let's say, singing the Psalms. That's safe because it's the Word of God. Other things could lead you astray. And we haven't quite figured out how to navigate that, although we do now have organs. And we do have things that we sing besides just Scripture. But, it wouldn't kill us necessarily to have visual beauty. And one of the things I keep agitating for is, we could have some color around here. It might help our thinking theologically.
One of the things this book offers is a theory that's really worth pondering. There's a certain kind of beauty, he calls it formal beauty, and separates it from a kind of a metaphysical beauty, and beauty by analogy. And the formal beauty, we only receive it in two ways, through the ears and through the eyes. and that the rest needs to be set aside for his purposes, thinking about beauty in the light of the redemption. That's an arresting claim, and we're going to object to it initially and say, well, what about taste? Isn't taste the model for all beauty? He's got a good argument, and it's actually hard to resist, so it's something you can learn from him if you want to pick up this book. I'm not selling the book. I'm just saying there's something interesting in it.
No, it's a great book. It is very good. I happen to think it's Hildebrand's best on beauty, better than his aesthetics primary. So it's a great book. Father, earlier you mentioned, you were referring to the postmodern where the aesthetic has replaced morality. And you made what I took to be an interesting comment about the kind of dark undertones or the tragic. Hearing you all talk about kitsch made me think about the role of the awful or the ugly or the disfigured. You know, it's very tempting to think of beauty as the pretty, the pleasant. Right? Beauty is well defined by Thomas as being which causes delight. You mentioned Umberto Eco. He has lovely books on beauty. He also has that one on ugliness, just ugly images. Right. The crucified one was not good to look upon. What role, if any, is there in church or outside of church for the awful, the ugly, the bloody, the wounded, not merely the pretty?
I think this is where you get a little bit of leverage by zooming out to the aesthetic. And so to touch down on a really concrete example, Shostakovich's Fifth Symphony comes to mind. He's asked to write something more appealing to common people, more beautiful. He gives you a little bit of that in the last movement, but it's an aesthetic that rings hollow, it's shiny, and false. But there are moments in that symphony that unbelievably are able to capture political terror and mass suffering, and they are not pretty to hear. They're extremely disturbing. But you want to hear them, and what he's doing in essence is taking the common experiences that are ugly, but we have co-suffered them, and putting them in a museum frame of music and letting us see them without being in them, standing outside from a sort of God's eye view in order to distance ourselves but co-appreciate what we are suffering. And so aesthetically speaking, that makes perfect sense. But if you think beauty is prettiness, it makes no sense at all.
On this subject, I think of not Reformed thinkers, but Lutheran thinkers like Luther himself and Kierkegaard, that there's an irony involved in the cross. Like the beauty of God is in the ugliness of Christ dying on the cross, his bloodied face. And all of the suffering of humanity somehow can be thought theologically about in terms of the crucifixion as a wretchedness, a God-forsakenness. And there is a kind of ironic beauty in that God experiences rejection, torture, persecution or execution by the state, and everybody leaves him. And it's a poignant, ironic beauty. But I think Luther's right. If you want to see what the beauty of God, you look at the face of Christ on the cross.
Yes, I completely agree. And I think, one of the dangers of sacred art that trends towards the kitsch or even ends in iconoclasm is that it's not fundamentally incarnational, and it doesn't direct one's attention to the sacred mysteries, particularly to the mystery of the incarnation of Christ and his death and resurrection as well. And so the only thing in that sense, from a more transcendent perspective, that could make suffering beautiful at all would be God's presence. Otherwise, it would simply be devoid. It would be an experience that was simply awful, right? And what enables some sense of transcendence there is divine embrace, I think, and good art in this sense, according to the mind of Aquinas or Aristotle, is going to mimic nature with an end towards leading you towards the formalities that underlie the goodness of nature itself. And so even a depiction of something awful, right, in this sense, I think true art will always have at least the intentionality of finding its way home. Whether or not the artist, him or herself, found that personally or not, the art as a product and as an experience has that capacity, if it's true art, and avoids the foibles of kitsch or iconoclasm.
Gordon, I appreciated your joke about everything being beige. Robert Barron has referred to Beige Catholicism, which is the Catholicism which doesn't believe very much, nothing too controversial, but it also doesn't have much awfulness to it. The sanctuary is beige. The wounded Christ is gone. The music is the best of 1978, which, as we all know, was the pinnacle of human civilization. It just makes no claims or demands on anyone, and so no one responds to the claims or the demands. Trying to think about how to use beauty, it's the wrong approach. David's already corrected me rightly for using it, but fine. How to use beauty, particularly church beauty, religious beauty, at a time where it seems to me at least somewhat plausible that the old American civil religion, which did provide unity, not for all, but for many as part of the cultural story, that civil religion is in quick and grave decline. There is very little sense of a common story. I'm thinking of McIntyre's sense of being asked to die for the United States is like being asked to die for Verizon. It provides a service, you pay for it, and that's it. It's a secular society. It's not a religious state. Civil religion and its common story is in decline. Should the church use beauty, access beauty for national common good, for political common good, or are we to stay in church, have beauty for church, recover ourselves first? You see the thrust of my question, I hope.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of complexities there that I don't know if I can resolve here, but I do think it's the case that for a long time, theology has been sort of carrying the weight of philosophy in modernity and in post-modernity. And so nothing will really, that is to say, nothing will really take the place of an authentic recovery of natural philosophy and the political components thereof. So that would be the first thing I would say. But be that as it may, there's an awful lot that theology and ecclesiology and the church as an organ of society can do to promote the goodness of the human person and the goodness of society through its own behavior and through its own, even its aesthetic appeal, to the extent that that's an outward-facing experience that people have of the church. But what's different, I think, that a theological perspective brings is, a sort of top-down perspective on creation itself, which is sapiential and infused with an experience of divine wisdom that comes through faith, hope, and love. I think that does have a very particular, although sometimes hard to define, aesthetic face. But I think we should work to cultivate it for the common good of ourselves and of society.
I came home from the dinner last night, and my wife was outraged. And I said, "What's the matter?" She said, "They preempted Jeopardy for the NFL draft." And at 9:30, it was still going on. And I thought, this is a very weird phenomenon. I think it's a kind of attempt at civil religion reasserting itself. It's the beauty of competition. I mean, there's a mania, an alternative religion, which is sports in America. And so the question is, can churches provide a compelling alternative to the beauty of athletic competition? I think it has to be the beauty of love. Love for refugees, love for poor people, love for enemies. I mean, if we're going to get anywhere, and that's going to be compelling, it has to be the beauty of acts of love.
On the note of compelling, this is why kitsch, to go back to that, now we can see why it's so dangerous. Because we live in a world starved for beauty. Therefore, there's a real possibility of the church supplying something that isn't going to be found anywhere else. But it's got to be believable. It can't be unbelievable, because what people think about the church is that we're naive. Or hypocritical. Or both. And if you come into the sacred space and you're served an incredible, an unbelievable form of beauty, nothing but bad is going to follow from that. But if you enter that space, and it's extremely difficult to do. Be mindful of the fact that after World War I, after the sheer evil marvel of that war, classical music fell silent. I mean, nobody knew what they could say because music couldn't marvel anymore. We're not there now. Music can marvel. It can make us marvel. But it's got to be authentic, I think. So there is a danger there.
It seems, one of the ongoing scandals, of course, of our own witness is that we ourselves are not in unity. We represent various traditions just here, in fact. But even internal to the various traditions, there is not an agreement about what authenticity would mean in churchly beauty or religious beauty or acts of beauty. What would your advice or counsel be to those of us who, without a sort of naivete about, we can snap fingers and have unity, how we ought to think about overcoming differences of what we believe to be authentic in beauty, in religious life, and so on? What is a path forward for us recovering some of our own witness with the beauty of the love we have for each other?
While they're thinking, Respighi wrestled with this problem, the Italian composer Respighi. And he thought Italy had a unique solution. And he returned, not nostalgically, but he returned to the church modes, those primitive building blocks of Western music that never entirely left our music, but which became somewhat subordinated to the fetishization of dissonance and complexity. He returned to those modes, and I think I think his music speaks with tremendous authenticity because of its grounding in the past and its refusal to deny what has happened historically. In other words, it acknowledges modernity, but it gives it a footing in the past that gives his listeners a sense of a narrative that is comprehensible and makes sense. He redeems the present by linking it to our grounding in Catholic past.
I think we need to form people, at least I'm speaking as an educator now, a Christian educator, form people in a way that reflects the dynamics of the Trinity, where persons have both clear identity and openness to one another. And, it's always dangerous to sort of make analogies to human formation, but nevertheless, I've been in ecumenical dialogues and interfaith dialogues, and the worst thing is for Protestant liberals, of which I kind of tend towards, to do a watered down, let's all get alongism. It's much more productive to be who you are, right? To own your identity and your particularity and to be open. That's the trick. Is not to be open at the sake of giving up on your identity, but not to so assert your identity that you can't be open. Holding together clear commitments that you stand for something and you're open to learn from others and to be open to be influenced by them and to share. That's the trick in our polity as a society, is to how do we help people to be who they are in their identity and be open to the other. We haven't really solved that yet.
Yes, I think from the perspective of the Catholic tradition, at least the authentic renewal will always come from a renewed adherence to the body of Christ through the theological virtues, and that implies communion. That implies the body of the church. That implies a broader commitment to humanity and society as well. And I think good aesthetics follow from that, not automatically, certainly, but do follow from that. And without that first fundamental building block, we'll simply dissolve into a kitsch which avoids actual problems in a way which becomes morally offensive, right? Or into a kind of traditionalism which is simply an empty recreation of the past, and neither of those is sufficient for the future. So.
Are many more questions to ask, of course, but our time has come to a close. Thank you, Father Reginald and David and Gordon. Appreciate it.